In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how to create this Procedural Mars Planet material in Blender. Now, because this is a very complex material, it's going to take a while to create, and so I've decided to split up this tutorial into two parts. So this is part 1, and I'll be posting part 2 soon after I post part 1, so the link to part 2 will be in the description. So in part 1, we're going to do the 3D setup, and we're also going to set up all of the main group of textures. And then in part 2, we're going to be finishing off the material. We're also going to be adding the planet atmosphere, and we're going to join the material together into the custom node group. And what's really cool about this Procedural Mars material is we're going to be adding this sunlight, and when you move the sunlight around, the sunlight is always going to point at the Mars planet. And you can see the visibility of the atmosphere is also adapting when I move the sun around. And on the top of the Mars planet, there's also going to be some ice poles. So after we create the procedural material, I'm going to show you how to join it together into this custom node group. So we have the Mars scale, and this is going to change the size of the surface material, but it won't affect the scale of the poles. Then we also have the poles scale, so we can make the poles bigger or smaller. And then we also have the poles visibility. So if you want the ice poles to be very visible, you can turn this up, or you can turn it down if you want them to be more subtle. And then we also have 3 main Mars colors. So we have Mars colors 1, 2, and 3. Then we also have the patches scale, and that is those little dark areas on the Mars planet. So you can see I can turn this down, and there's much smaller patches. And then we also have the patches color. Then we also have the patches visibility, so if I don't want the patches, I can turn that down. And then we also have the patches distortion. Then we also have the atmosphere amount, and then we also have the atmosphere strength to make it brighter. And then we also have this atmosphere color, and then we also have the large craters scale. So if I kind of zoom in here, you can see there's some craters on Mars, and you can change the size of that there. And then we also have some smaller craters, and those are going to be those little craters right there. Then we also have the craters color, and then I also have the canyon scale. So there's basically these little areas where there's kind of little cracks, and so those are some big canyons on the planet's surface, and I can change the scale of that there. And then I can also change the color of the canyons. Then we have the roughness, and then we also have a bunch of bump strengths. So I have the noise bump strength, then I also have the surface bump strength, then we also have the canyons bump strength, then we also have the craters bump strength, and then finally the poles bump strength. And if you'd like to help support this channel and purchase this material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack. And you can also check out my procedural material packs to purchase packs of 10 materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can also check out my procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. All the links are in the description. Alright, so here I am in a new scene in Blender, and my screencast keys are going to be right down here in the corner so you can see what buttons I'm pressing. So I'm just going to start by selecting everything, and I will hit X, and I'm going to click on delete. So I now want a nice smooth sphere for the planet, so I'll press Shift A. I'm going to go to Mesh, and I'm going to add an icosphere. And then right above me, if you click on the add icosphere settings, I'm going to turn these subdivisions up to 6. And then I can close this, so now we have a nice smooth round sphere. And then you can use the object context menu to shade the object smooth. So I now want another object which is going to control where the atmosphere is. So I'm going to press Shift A, and let's go down here to empty, and I'm just going to add the plane axis. And then so that we can see this, I'll just hit S to scale that up. And so later on, we will rig this so that it'll rotate with the sunlight, and this will control where the atmosphere is visible. So I'm also going to press Shift A, and I'm going to go here to light, and I'm going to add the sunlight. And I can bring the sunlight over here, and I can rotate it towards the planet. And then also, if you haven't saved the Blender file, just click on File and click on Save As and save it somewhere to your computer, and that way if Blender crashes, you won't lose your progress. And you can press Ctrl S to save the Blender file as you're working on the project. So I'm going to hold down the Z button, and I'm going to move my mouse up into the rendered view, and I would definitely recommend using the Cycles rendering engine in this tutorial because this material is a little bit laggy in Blender Eevee, and I'm also going for realism, so I would definitely recommend using Cycles for this tutorial. So just hold down the Z button and go into the rendered view because I want to preview the sunlight. Now you can see the background is all gray, so just for the time being, I'm going to click here on the world properties, and I'm going to click on color here, and I'm going to turn this to fully black just for now. But later in the video, I'm going to be creating a star background in the world. So now let's click right over here to the object data properties and make sure you have the sunlight selected. And I'm going to turn the strength up to 8 so it's a bit brighter. And then here on the color, I'm going to make this a slight yellow color so it looks more like sunlight. And then also here on the angle, I want to turn this angle up to like a 30. And by turning the angle up, you can see that the fade is going to be a bit more soft. Whereas if I turn the angle down, it's going to be really sharp. But I want to turn that up to 30 so it's a little bit more soft. Now, when I move the planet around, I want this empty here to move with the planet because the empty object is going to control where the atmosphere is visible. So I'm going to select the empty, then I'm going to hold down the shift key and select the planet. So the planet is selected last. So I'm now going to press Control P and then I'm going to set parent to object. So this way, when I click on the planet and move the planet around, you can see the empty is moving with it. And if I hold down the Z button and go back to solid view, you can see that a bit better. And also if I rotate the planet, it moves along with it. Now the rotation of the empty is going to control where the atmosphere is visible. And I only want the atmosphere to be visible where the light is shining on the planet. So I want this empty to always be rotated over where the light is. And that way when I move the light, it's going to move the visibility of the atmosphere. So I'm going to select the empty object and I'm going to click right here to the object constraint properties. And I'll click on add object constraint and I'm going to add the track to. So add the track to the empty. Now here on the target, I want to click on the eyedropper and I'm going to choose the sun. And so this way, if I select the sun and move the sun around, you can see that empty is always rotating with the sun. Now when I move the sunlight around, I also want the sunlight to always be rotating towards the planet. So if you click on the sunlight, I can click on add object constraint and I can also add a track to the sun. And then if I click on the eyedropper, I want to select the icosphere, which is the planet. So now if I select the sun and move it around by hitting G to grab, you can see it's always going to be pointed towards the planet. So if I hold down the Z button and go into rendered mode, I can now move this around and it's going to change where the sun is shining on the object. So I will go back to solid view. But then if I select the planet and move the planet around, the sun will also still point at the planet. So I will hold down the Z button and move my mouse back to the solid view. So I now want to add that space background with the little stars. And for that, we're going to be using a procedural setup. So what I'm going to do is click right here on the shading workspace, and on the shading workspace I have the 3D viewport right over here and the shader nodes over here. So I'm going to hold down the Z button and go up into the rendered view. And then I don't want to add a material right now, I want to edit the world nodes. So if I click here on object, I can change this to world instead. And right now we just have the black background. So to make a star texture, I'm going to press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture. Let's drop this here, and I can plug the distance up to the color. And if I look around here now in the world, you can see there's all these little dots. Now I want to make this much more contrasty, so I'll press Shift A and go to the search, and I'll search for a color ramp, and I'll put the color ramp in between the Voronoi and the background. So I can now drag these tabs together, and that's going to make it more contrasty. And I actually want to flip the values, so I'm going to bring the white tab over here, and then I'll bring the black tab way over here. So now if I look around, I can see a few stars here and there. Now I do want to have lots more stars and I want them to be smaller. So here on the scale on the Voronoi, I will turn this to 200. And now there's going to be a bunch of little stars, but they are a bit hard to see, so I can make them stronger. So here on the strength, I'm going to turn this strength up to like 18, and that's going to make the stars a bit brighter. So now you can see them all around the planet. So let's now go back here to the layout, and I'm now going to add a camera. So I'll press Shift A, and I'm going to go down here and add a camera, and then I can move around to where I want the camera to be, and I want the camera to be like right about here. And then I can press Control Alt Numpad 0. Control Alt Numpad 0 is going to bring the camera to where we are. And then if you select the camera, you can hit G to grab and you can move the camera around. And then also if you click right here on the object data properties of the camera, I want to turn the focal length up. So I'll turn the focal length up to like 80, and that's going to zoom the camera in, and that way things will look a bit more flat. I can also press G to grab, and then I can hit the Z key twice, and that'll bring the camera in and out. Now if you click right here on the output properties, I do want to change the resolution. So I'm going to change the X and Y resolution to 1920 by 1920. So I'll turn these both to 1920. But then I want this to be a very high quality image because I want to see a lot of the detail. So here on the percentage, I'm going to change this to 200. But that will take longer to render because it's a much larger image. So you could just leave this at 100 if you want to. And then I can again hit G to grab, move this up. I can also double tap the R key and then move move the camera around, and then I can hit G to grab and double tap the Z key and bring this in. And I'm just going to point the camera right at the planet. And I can hold down the Z button, go up into the rendered mode to see how that is looking. So now let's click right here on the render properties, and I did mention this earlier, I would recommend using Cycles Render because this material is kind of laggy in Blender Eevee, and also Cycles looks much more realistic. So I would recommend using Cycles. And then if you go down here to the color management, I'm going to use the view transform of Filmic, and here on the look, I'm going to change this to very high contrast. And this will make the colors more contrasty and saturated. So I can now select the planet and we can create the material. So I'm going to click over here to go to the shading workspace. And I can hit the 0 on the numpad to go into the camera view, and you can hold down the Z button and move your mouse up into the rendered view. And also I want to add a render border. So here in the camera, I'm going to press Ctrl B, and I'm going to click and drag over the camera and then let go. And this way it's only going to render a preview of what the camera can see. And then let's click here on world, and I'm going to change this back to object so that we can edit the object materials. And you can just select the planet, and then you can click on new here to add a new material. And I can just rename the material to Mars. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click here on edit and you can go to the preferences, and then over there in the add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler and you can checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So let's now create the first group of textures. So I'm going to start by pressing Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture, and let's drop this down here. And then because I turned on the Node Wrangler, I can hold down the Control and Shift key and I can select different nodes, and that is going to preview the node on the object. And then also with the noise texture selected, I'm going to press Ctrl T, and that's going to add the texture, coordinate, and mapping nodes. And I want to take the object and I want to put that into the vector. And by using the object coordinates, it's going to place the textures on the object more evenly. And we can also use the mapping to change the entire size of the material. I'm also going to click and drag to box select the texture, coordinate, and mapping. And I'm going to press Ctrl J. Ctrl J is going to join them together into this frame, and it will become kind of complex. So we're going to use the frames to help us organize the nodes. Now, if you select the frame, you can press F2 to add a label, and I can just call this mapping. So now let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 7. I'm also going to turn the detail to the max of 15, so it's very detailed, and I'll also turn the roughness up to a 0.55. So now we have a nice detailed noise texture. Now this texture isn't very interesting, so I want to mix it together with another texture. So I'm going to press Shift A, and let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the wave texture. I'll drop the wave texture up here, and I can Control Shift and select the wave texture to preview it. And then I want the mapping vector to be going into the vector of the wave texture. So now let's change some of the settings to make this more noisy and random. So I'm going to turn the scale to like a 0.35, just a 0.35, and that way there isn't very many of those waves. But then I'm going to distort it, so here on the distortion, I'm going to turn this up to like a 40. And then I want to add much more detail to this, so I'll turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And then here on the detail scale, I'm going to turn this to a 0.7. And that way it's looking quite a bit more random. And then also here on the detail roughness, I'm going to turn this to a 0.65. So now it is looking much more organic and natural. So I now want to mix both of these two different textures together. So I'll press Shift A, and I can go down here to color, and I'm going to add the mix color. Just drop this here. And then I want to take this wave texture color, and I'm going to put that into color A. And here on the noise texture, I can take the factor, and I'm going to put that into color B. And then I can Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. So this factor is determining whether it's going to use A or B, and so we're just blending between them. But I want to click on this mix here, and I'm going to change this to the linear light instead. So this way it's mainly just using the wave texture, but we're now using the noise texture to kind of make the wave a bit more noisy. So I'll turn the factor all the way up to 1. And now you can kind of see there still are those waves, but they're kind of in these noisy clumps. And so that is looking very interesting. And also, if you don't want to see the grid in the 3D viewport, you can click right here on the overlays, and then you can turn off the floor and also the X and Y axis, and that way you can't see the grid. And I do like that a bit better. So I now want to make the two main colors for Mars. So I'll press Shift A, and I can go here to color, and again I'm going to add another mix color, and let's stick this after the linear light, so just stick it right here. Now I want the result to actually be going into the factor, so that'll tell it where it's going to be A and where it's going to be B. So I can now make the two main colors for Mars. So here on A, I'm going to make this kind of like a light tan color for the sand, and then here on B, I'm going to make this another kind of tan color, but it'll be a bit darker, so it'll be like a brown color. And if you want to use the same exact colors that I'm using, then here on color A, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in AF724A. And then if you want to use the same color that I'm using for color B, you can go to the hex and you can punch in 493528. Now these colors are very contrasty, and so I actually want to make them a bit more subtle. So what I'm going to do is click and drag to box select these nodes, and I'm going to bring them over a bit, and that way we have a bit more space here. So I can now press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp between the linear light and the mix. And I can kind of drag these back to compress them a little bit more. So then here on the color ramp, I can click on the white tab, and I can click on the color, and if I turn this down, it's going to make that darker color more subtle. So I'm just going to make this kind of like a mid-gray color. And if you want to use the same hex value that I'm using, you can punch in B3, B3, B3. So I'm now going to click and drag and box select the wave and the noise and the linear light and the color ramp. So just select these 4 nodes. And I can press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame. And if you select the frame, you can press F2, and I'm going to rename this to Noise 1. So I now want to make another noisy texture, so I'll press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture, and let's drop this up here, and I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture to preview it. Now if I click here on the F1, I want to change this to distance to edge instead, and you can see we have this little cracked texture. Now you can see the lines are very smooth, and they're not very random, and they don't look very organic. So I'm going to use this wave texture to distort the placement of the Voronoi texture. So let's take the color here, and I can put that into the vector of the Voronoi. And now you can see we have this really cool detailed texture. Now that is being distorted a bit too much, and so I want to make it a bit more subtle. So I want the wave texture to have less of an effect over the Voronoi. So I'm going to click on this linear light here. I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll just drop it down here. And I want to bring it out of the frame, so I'll just press Alt P. Alt P will bring it out of the frame, and I can now bring it up here, and I want to drop it in between the wave and the Voronoi. Now I want the wave texture to be going into color B, and then I want this original mapping, which isn't distorted, to be going into color A. So now I can drag the factor around, and if I turn the factor to 0, it's not being distorted at all because it's using color A, or if I turn the factor up, it's going to be very distorted. So I'm just going to turn the factor to like a 0.2, and that way it still is somewhat distorted, but it's not quite as distorted. So now we have this really interesting texture. And later on, we'll be mixing both of these textures together to create a more interesting Mars texture. So I now want to click and drag to box select these 2 nodes. I can press Ctrl J to join it together into a frame. I can kind of drag these over, and then if you select the frame and press F2, I can call this Noise 2. So I'm now going to create the group of textures of those little darker areas around the planet. So I'll press Shift A and let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's drop this up here, and then I want to take this mapping right here. I'm going to take the vector, and I'm going to stick this up here into the vector, the noise texture. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. So now let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm just going to turn the scale to a 1.5, and then I'll also turn the detail all the way to the max of 15, and also to give the noise even more detail, let's turn the roughness to a 0.65. Now I want to make this much more contrasty because it's pretty grayed out, so I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's drop this here after the noise texture. And I can now drag these tabs together, and that's going to make it more contrasty. And I'm actually going to flip the values, so I'm going to drag the white tab to about here, and I'll drag the black tab to about there. Now I want to be able to control the rotation of the patches. So I'm going to press Shift A and go to the search, and I'm going to search for a mapping node, and let's drop another mapping node in between this mapping and the noise. So just drop it right there. And now we have these rotation values, and so we can rotate this around, and wherever the lightest parts are, that is where you're going to be able to see those dark patches. So you can change the rotation values to whatever you want, or you could also leave it how it is, but I'm going to change the X rotation to 40, and then I'm also going to turn the Y rotation to 120. And then I want there to be a bit more white, so if I go here to this color ramp, I'm going to drag the black a little bit farther back, and I'll bring the white over. Now later on, when we join this together into a custom node group, I also want to be able to control the brightness of these patches. So to control the brightness, I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the hue saturation value, and let's put this in between the noise texture and the color ramp. So I can now change this value, and if I drag this up and down, that is going to make it brighter or darker. And so I can use this value later on in the custom node group to control the brightness of those patches. So I'm now going to click and drag to box select these 4 nodes, and I can press Ctrl J to join them into a frame, and I will select the frame and press F2, and I'm going to add a label, and I'll call this patches. So I'm now going to be creating the textures for the craters. So to do that, I'm actually going to go way down here, and I'm going to create the group of textures down here. So to start off, I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for a Voronoi texture and drop this here, and then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture to preview it. And then I want to use the same mapping, so let's plug the vector up to the vector of the Voronoi, and this way the mapping can control the entire size of the entire material, because it's plugged up to all the textures. So now wherever these little dark circles are, that is where the craters are going to be. So let's change the scale. So I'm going to turn the scale to a 3.5, and that way the craters are going to be bigger. And then I want to make this more contrasty, so I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for another color ramp, and let's put the color ramp after the Voronoi. And then I can click on the white tab and I can drag it over, and that's going to make it much more contrasty. So I'm going to drag it to right about here, and that way you can still see the craters, but there's not quite as many and they're a bit smaller. Now, as well as having larger craters, I also want to have some smaller craters. So I'm going to select the Voronoi and the color ramp, and I'm going to press Control Shift D. Control Shift D is going to duplicate the nodes, but it'll keep the wires plugged up. And then I can Control Shift and select the color ramp. And then for this one, I want to turn the scale to like a 20 on the Voronoi, and that way there's going to be a bunch of small little craters. Now if I zoom in closely to the craters, you can see they're very smooth and they aren't very noisy or random. So what I'm going to do is hold down the Shift key, and then I'm going to right click and drag over these 2 wires and then let go, and that's going to add a reroute. And so now there's just 1 wire going to the reroute, and then it's being plugged up to both Voronois. So I'm going to take this noise texture here and I'm going to plug it into the vectors, and that way it's going to distort the Voronoi textures. So I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to go down here to color, and I'm going to add a mix color, and let's drop this in here in between the mapping and both of the Voronoi textures. And then I want this mapping to be going into color A. So then here on color B, I'm going to take the noise texture factor, and I'm going to plug this into color B. So now you can see the noise texture is being mixed with the original mapping, and so it is distorting the Voronoi textures. And then I can drag the factor around, and that's going to control how much it's being distorted. And when I drag the factor around, you can see that it's moving the texture around a lot. So I'm going to click on this mix here, and I'm going to change the type to linear light instead. And this way, if I drag the factor, it's still going to distort the Voronoi texture, but it's not going to move it around quite as much. So then I want this to be very subtle. I only want it to distort the edges a bit. So I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.08. And that way you can still definitely see the craters, but they're not quite as circular and they're a bit more of a random shape. So we have a texture for the smaller craters and a texture for the larger craters, and I do want to mix them together. However, before we mix them together, I want to change the shape of it. So we're going to take these craters and we're going to eventually put them into the normal to give the material some bump. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the bump node, and let's drop this here. And then I want to take the top color ramp and I want to put the color into the height value of the bump, and I can Control Shift and select the bump to preview it. So you can see where those dark areas are, those are where the craters are going to be. So right now the craters look like they're going back in, but I want to change the shape of the craters. So to change the shape of the craters, I can press Shift A, I can go to the search, and I'm going to search for the RGB curves, and I'm going to drop the RGB curves in between the color ramp and the bump. And I can drag this up here so I have a bit more space. So the color ramp is going into the RGB curves, and the RGB curves is going into the bump, so that we can actually preview what it's going to look like. So I can now change the curve of the RGB curves, and that is actually going to change the shape of the craters. So what I'm first going to do is click right here in the center to add a dot here. And I'm going to zoom in so I can see this better, and I'm going to drag this dot right about down here, kind of into the corner of this square. And then I'm going to click right up here on this one in the corner, and I'm going to drag this one way down, and I'm going to stick it right down here, almost on the very bottom. And you can see now that I've done that, if you look closely at the crater, it kind of starts to go up, and then it's a bit flat, and then it starts to go down. So basically this curve here is going to be the same shape as the crater. So now I'm also going to hold down the Control key and click here to add another dot, and I'm going to drag this one up a bit, kind of drag it over here, and then I can hold down the Control key and click again to add another dot, and I'm going to drag this one down kind of about there. So this way it's going to be a bit flatter on the top. And then I can hold down the control key and click again to add another dot, and I can drag this down. I can also drag this one over a little bit. And then this dot here, I'm going to drag this up and I'm going to stick it about there. So we basically have this little curve here and then it goes down. And so that looks much more like a crater because it kind of goes up and it's a bit noisy. Then there's a little top part around the top of the crater and then it goes back down. And you can see that is happening for most of the other craters. Now I'm not going to be setting up the bump right now, but I did just want to add the bump node to show you what this is doing. So I can now click on the bump and I can press X to delete it. Now I also want this RGB curves to be affecting the small craters. So let's click on the RGB curves and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, drop it down here. And then I want to take this color ramp here. So this is the smaller craters and I'll put the color into the color of the RGB curves. And I can control Shift and select the RGB curves and it's going to be doing the same thing as the top one. So I'm now going to mix these two RGB curves together. And that way we'll have one texture with the small craters and the large craters. So to do that, I'm going to click on this linear light and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and I'll drop it here. And then I want to take this color from the RGB curves, I'll put that into color A, and then the bottom one, I'm going to put that into color B. And then I can control Shift and select the linear light. Now, both of these crater textures, the lighter colors are going to be the craters. So I just want to add the light values. So if I click here on the linear light, I can change this to lighten instead. And then I can turn the factor all the way up to 1. And that way it's going to add both of the light values from each of the textures. And so now we're mixing both of the crater textures together. So I can now click and drag to box select all of these nodes. I'll press Ctrl J to add a frame. Let's drag this down here, and then with the frame selected, I'll press F2, and I can just call this craters. So I now want to create a group of textures for the canyons. So to do that, I'm going to go right up here, and I'm going to do this up here. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for another Voronoi texture. Let's drop this here, and then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi to preview it. And then just like the other textures, I want to take this mapping, let's drag this up here so it is closer, and I want to take the vector, and I want to put this into the vector of the Voronoi. And let's change the scale of the Voronoi texture. So I'm going to turn the scale to 115. Now I want to use another texture to distort the placement of the Voronoi texture. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search and I'll search for another noise texture. And let's put this noise texture between the mapping and the Voronoi. So now it's going to distort that texture. And then let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to a very small number of 0.1. And then let's also turn the detail to the max of 15, and I'm also going to turn the roughness up to a 0.55 so it is a bit more rough. And then I do want to turn the distortion up a little bit, so I'm going to turn the distortion to a 0.14. So I now want to make this more contrasty so that it looks like canyons. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for another color ramp, and let's put this after the Voronoi. And then I can drag the black tab over, and that's going to make it more contrasty. And as I drag this over, you can see now the lightest areas are standing out, and it looks like little cracked canyons. And I'm also going to click on the white tab, and I'll drag the white tab over a little bit. And maybe I'll bring the black tab back a bit. And then I don't want the white tab to be quite as bright, so I'll click on the white tab, I can click on the color, and I can make this a little bit darker so it's kind of a gray color. And if you want to use the same hex value that I'm using on this light gray, you can go to the hex and you can punch in 9 6 times. So just a nice light gray. So now we have the textures for the canyons. So I can now click and drag to box select these 3 nodes, and I can press Ctrl J again to add a frame, and I'll click on the frame and press F2, and I'm going to call this canyons. Alright, so the last group of textures that we're going to be creating is the poles. So to create the poles, I first want to create a gradient, which is just going to be on the top, and then we'll also create another gradient on the bottom. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a gradient texture, and let's drop this here, and I can Control Shift and select the gradient texture to preview it. So you can see it starts out as black and then it gets whiter and whiter. Now I do want the gradient texture to be using the object coordinates, but I don't want this mapping to be controlling it, because this mapping node is going to change the entire size of the material. But if I plug this mapping up to the poles, then when I change the size of it, the poles are going to kind of come down and it's not going to work that well. And so in the custom node group, I want a different scale value, which is going to control just the size of the poles. So I'm going to take the object coordinates from the texture coordinate, and I'm going to drag this up here, and I'm going to stick it into the vector of the gradient texture. Then I'm going to press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a mapping, and let's drop this mapping right here between the texture coordinate and the gradient. So now this mapping node we can use to change the size of the ice poles if we want to. Now I also need another mapping node to control where the gradient is. So I'm going to click on this mapping, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll drop it here after the first one. So now we have another mapping node, and we can just use this to transform the rotation of the gradient. So I'm going to drag the gradient right down here. So then on this mapping, I can rotate the gradient. So I'm going to take the rotation Y value, and I'm going to turn this to a -90. So -90, and I can see it's there at the bottom. And then I can take this location X value, and I can drag this into a negative number, and that is going to bring it down so you can just see it down there. So on the location X, I'm going to turn this to a -0.65. So now there's just this little white area down here. Now this doesn't really look like an ice pole because it is very smooth around the edges. So I want to add a noise texture, and then I want the noise texture to affect the edges of the gradient. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, I'm going to add a noise texture, and let's put the noise texture right up here above the gradient. And I can Control Shift and select it to preview it. And then this mapping here, this is going to control the entire scale of the ice poles. So let's take this vector from this mapping, and let's put that into the vector of the noise texture. And then I can change some of the noise texture settings. So I'll turn the scale to like a 4. Let's also turn the detail all the way up to the max of 15. And I also want to make it even more detailed, so I'll turn the roughness up to a 0.7. And I do want to add a bit of distortion, so I'll turn the distortion to a 0.5. So I now want to mix the noise texture with the gradient so that the noise texture distorts the edges of the gradient. So I'll press Shift A, and I'll go down here to color, and I'm going to add the mix color. Let's just drop this here, and then I want to take the gradient color, and I'm going to put that into color B. And then I'm going to take the noise texture factor, and I'm going to put that into color A. And I can Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. And then here on the type, if I click on mix, I want to change this to the linear light instead, and that way I can drag the factor, and so now you can see that there still is the gradient, and if I drag this around you can see the gradient, but the gradient basically has a noise texture on it. So I'm going to turn the factor all the way up to 1, and that way we're still using that gradient to basically tell where the noise texture is. Now I want to make this more contrasty because there are some areas where it's kind of dark, so I'll press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for a color ramp, and I'll drop the color ramp after the linear light. And then I want to drag these two tabs together to make it more contrasty. So I'm going to drag the black tab out just a little bit, but then I'm going to drag the white tab way over here so it is very contrasty. And that is going to be the texture for the ice poles. So I now want to take this entire setup and I want to duplicate it so that we can have more ice poles, and then I want to move this other ice pole to the top of Mars. So I'm going to click and drag to box select these nodes, and I'm going to bring them up. And then with all of these nodes selected, I'm going to press Control Shift D, and that'll duplicate the nodes, but it'll keep the wires plugged up. And I'll stick this here. And then I can Control Shift and select this color ramp. So we can now use this mapping to rotate where the ice pole is. So instead of it being rotated by -90, I want to click on this and I want to just change it to 90 instead. So just type in 90 here on the rotation Y. Now if I go here to the top of Mars, you can see there is the top ice pole. And you can drag this around if you want to change where it is. So I now want to mix both of the ice poles together. So I'll click on the linear light, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll drop it here. And then I can take the top color ramp, let's put that into A, and then this bottom color ramp, let's put that into B. And then I can Control Shift and select the linear light. Now I just want to add the light values because the poles are the light color. So I can click on the linear light and I can just change this to lighten. So right up here, change that to lighten. This way it's only going to add the light values, so now you can see we have both of the poles. And make sure the factor is turned all the way up to 1 so it adds both of them. So that is the group of textures for the ice poles. So I'm going to click and drag to box select all these nodes. Again, I'll press Ctrl J, and you can select the frame and press F2, and I'll rename this to poles. So if I zoom out now, you can see we have all these different groups of textures. And so because this is a pretty complex material, if I did this all in one video, it would be a little bit long. So I'm going to break up this tutorial into 2 parts. And so in part 2, we're going to be joining all the textures together, and then we're also going to be creating the atmosphere, and then we'll also create the custom node group. So to watch part 2, you can find the link in the video description, and I'll also put part 2 right up there on the end screen when it is released. And as I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to help support this channel and purchase this final material, then you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And you can also check out my Ultimate Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to purchase all of my materials. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next part.